let's get started on taking a look first at the anatomical relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The reason we look at this so carefully is that this is so strongly related to homeostasis. And as you learned in A&PII, if we cannot maintain homeostasis, we end up in a diseased or compromised state, and that can result in death. This slide focuses on the posterior pituitary. Now, before we go any further, I want to remind you what the term nucleus means when we apply it to structures in the central nervous system. A nucleus is a collection of nerve cell bodies in the CNS. And of course, our hypothalamus, being part of the diencephalon in the brain, is part of the CNS. So here we can see that the nerve cell bodies of these neurons, and here they're only showing a couple, are located in the hypothalamus, and then the axon stretches down into the posterior pituitary. These different nuclei secrete or manufacture specific neurohormones. Remember, a neurohormone is a product of nervous tissue secreted eventually into the bloodstream. So it's made by neural tissue but behaves like a hormone. These neurohormones diffuse down the axons, and from there in the posterior pituitary, they diffuse out of the axon terminals and into the bloodstream. And once they get into the bloodstream, then they are carried out to the rest of the body, and they go to the entire body, but will only bind to receptors on their target organs or cells. The anterior pituitary behaves differently. The anterior pituitary also has a mechanism that starts with nuclei in the hypothalamus. But the difference is that the secretions of these nuclei go into a capillary bed, a first capillary bed. And from there, those hormones follow a path through a connecting vessel to a second capillary bed. This is an example of a portal system. We'll see 3 of these in all in A&PII and A&PII Ch. A portal system is 2 capillary beds in series, one after the other. And that's not normal in the body. Normally we see an artery branching into an arteriole that branches into one capillary bed, which then drains into a small vein called a venule, and the venule will then empty into a vein. That's the normal pathway. But here we see a portal system. 2 capillaries in series. So again, back to the hypothalamus, we have nuclei of specific structures, specific neurons, specific cell bodies that secrete specific regulating hormones. Okay? These regulating hormones can trigger the release of something or the inhibition of something. These regulating hormones are tropic because they will affect the endocrine cells that are found in the anterior pituitary. These are secreted, diffusing down their axons, picked up in the first capillary bed, transported through the portal veins to the second capillary bed, and it is this second capillary bed where those regulatory hormones leave the bloodstream and target their specific target cells. And these specific target cells will then secrete these different anterior pituitary hormones. We'll look at those in more detail later. Now here I just want to set you up with a fairly standard pathway or mechanism that we are going to take a look at, not just with the thyroid gland, but with several others. So what we will see is that the hypothalamus secretes a regulatory hormone. In this pathway, we're looking at thyroid-releasing hormone. It targets the anterior pituitary, therefore this is tropic. It causes the anterior pituitary to secrete another hormone, in this case TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH is secreted into the bloodstream, carried to the thyroid gland, where it will bind to its receptors and cause the thyroid gland to do its magic. That means TSH is also tropic. The thyroid gland will secrete thyroid hormones into the bloodstream, travels to target cells. Some will stimulate, some will inhibit. But one thing that you will see is when there is an increase in one of these hormones, there is a humoral effect feeding back to the organs higher up in the chain. So as there is an increase here, there will be inhibition here. That's the minus, is inhibiting. In contrast, if there is a decrease here, if the thyroid hormones get too low, then that feeds back again humorally to mostly the hypothalamus, and it is excitatory. It will stimulate it to secrete more thyroid hormones. Again, a great example of homeostasis, in particular, a negative feedback cycle. I want to reiterate that this is a pathway, a mechanism that we will be seeing with numerous regulatory hormones and their effect on the anterior pituitary. So we will use the same first two organs, change their tropic hormones so that we can see how it will affect this other endocrine gland. This shows the thyroid gland, but we could be looking at the adrenal cortex as well as other glands. That will be in the next part of this chapter. These next two slides are from your textbook, table 16.3, and it takes you through the specific hormones that are secreted first by the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and ADH, or vasopressin, and those secreted by the anterior pituitary hormones. And there are at least 6 of those that you'll take a look at. Now, I'm not going to lecture over every single one of these when the information is right here in your table. So as you run through the rest of the notes here in part 1, fill them out using this table.